Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure seeing you all this morning. First of all, I would like to wish you all the best for the happy new year. And before we get started, as usual, I would like to remind you that this forum is carried out with a simultaneous translation. So please feel free to use headset for your convenience. Today, I'm so very happy to have a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Allen Sinai, as our special guest at the very first IG forum of not just this year, but this decade, I must say. I'm confident that his exceptional insights will help us understand the global economic outlook in the face of growing uncertainties around the world. Like all of you, I'm excited with great expectation for his speech entitled Charting Uncharted Waters, the US and the World in year 2020. Before we invite Dr. Sinai to the stage, let me say a few words about his outstanding credentials. Dr. Sinai is an internationally renowned economist and has been widely recognized as the world's leading expert with outstanding track record of forecasting accuracy. He is currently president and chief global economist at Decision Economics Incorporated, and he served as chief economist at Lehman Brothers, among other distinguished positions he held before. Without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Sinai, and he will speak for about 40 minutes, leaving around 20, 30 minutes for Q&A with the floor.
Once again, thank you very much for having me here. It's great to start the year in the dark and try to shed some light on the world and the U.S. economy, all issues that I hope are relevant and interesting to you. As the United States and the world begin the 2020 decade, new uncharted waters are being entered. They're economic, they're disinflationary, very low inflation all over the world, technology, policies, especially monetary, financial markets, politics, geopolitics, and investments. Those are all big topics as we start 2020 in a world and structure of economies, markets, policies, and with technology that is so different than when I first spoke here about 40 years ago. Would you believe that? 40 years ago. Do I look 105? There'll be an analogy to old age for those here who are a little on the older side. The numbers mean nothing. I want you to know I'm an economist, statistician, econometrician. I live, eat, breathe numbers. I ignore them. I ignore them when it comes to age. Forget it. You're only as old as you feel, not as old as the number is associated with when you came out of your mother's womb. The 2020 U.S. and global economy and market prospects involve questions and issues that go beyond previous business cycles. The American business expansion is in its 11th year. I'm going to tell you, I can't see the end of this expansion. Chronologically old, functionally young. Australia has grown, I think, 27 years. How old is old in the business expansion? Well, we'll explore that a little bit in the context of this very long expansion in the United States. The state of knowledge is so different. The structure of the economy, technology is so different. We are in truly uncharted waters with not much historical precedent or data to go by in an economically, financially, politically, and geopolitically uncertain and chaotic world. The example that I think is very clear of not enough data has to do with technical change. You will hear me tell you that I believe, and have some empirical work that supports it, that technology and technical change is the major reason for low inflation around the world, and for what I'm going to tell you is the death of the Phillips curve, the old-time relationship between falling unemployment rates and rising inflation. If the Phillips curve is dead, and finally central banks around the world have accepted the fact that it's no longer a paradigm that's useful in policymaking, then monetary policy has to be different. Monetary policy cannot be run by any central bank in a major part of the world, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the US, Korea, by expecting inflation to pick up when labor markets get tight. That doesn't happen anymore. In fact, in the history of the Phillips curve, which is the relationship between inflation and unemployment, only on one episode did inflation rise and accelerate with a falling unemployment rate. Way back in the 1960s. It didn't do what we saw in the 60s again, ever. And yet in the academic profession, powerfully strong, wonderful economists, Milton Friedman and Ed Phelps, and they may have spoken here, took the analysis, took the historical data of the 60s, applied it to all the future episodes, and no earlier than the 1970s, when we had oil prices quadrupling in 1973 to 1975, an external shock, and crude oil prices doubling in the Iranian conflict in 1979-80, we got rising unemployment and rising inflation. But the Phillips curve says that we should have, with rising unemployment, we should have falling inflation. It didn't happen. In the 1990s, we had falling inflation and falling unemployment. The unemployment rate fell below what was then thought to be the natural rate of unemployment, according to this theory, the Phillips curve paradigm, 6%. We dropped below 6% and inflation kept going down. It has really only worked one time. Yet central banks have used it as a paradigm of expecting inflation, and inflation in this episode has never come up to the 2% target of the major central banks of the world. That's hugely different for the business cycle. They have to get inflation higher, not lower. And the United States is in the 11th year of its expansion, and our central bank, big main goal now is to get inflation up, not down. Yesterday I met with Governor Kuroda, the Bank of Japan. What's his big problem? He's got to get inflation up, not down. The Japanese economy has an unemployment rate of 2.2%. Inflation is not accelerating at an unemployment rate of 2.2%. In the US, our unemployment rate's at a 50-year low. Wage and price inflation not accelerating. It doesn't work. It's gone. I'm going to tell you today that technology and technological change is at the heart of what we see. It's worldwide, and that's why we see low unemployment with low inflation everywhere in the world. Now, we don't have enough data, so I can't prove it as I would want to prove it as a scientist, as a PhD economist, a well-trained at a leading university. I don't have enough data. We don't produce enough data on the topic. There is some data. So in my test tube, I take a little bit of blood, run all the tests, and maybe I make a big deal out of that little bit of blood. Technology, to me, is the biggest source of the shift down in the Phillips curve. It has not worked. It's a major generator of low inflation around the world. Central banks have to get inflation to 2%. Technology is doing a great job for economies because it's helping keep inflation and interest rates low. Well, the waters that we are taking a motorboat ride through or sail through that I'm taking you through the uncharted waters. I've just given you a couple of examples of differences and why, as we enter this decade, we are sitting in such uncharted territory. An expansion that has lasted longer in the United States than any other time. Everybody expects it to die of old age. It's so long, it's got to stop. It doesn't. We get scared, the stock market sells off, and it keeps going. Well, uncharted water message number one. And I have some number of these, I won't do them all, is the U.S. record-long expansion, can it continue? Can it continue? Absolutely yes, is my view. That has been my view for 11 years. We do a survey, Wall Street Journal does a survey of economists every month and asks what the probability of recession is in the next 12 months. And back in late 2008, I began to say, we were still in a recession, but looking out 12 months, we thought we were going to come out of it in October of 2009. We came out by the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research Marketing, in June. And I began to take down the odds of recession. I think by and this is on record, the early part of 2009, the odds on recession in the next 12 months, I had at 0. Those odds on recession in the next 12 months on that survey, documented from me, have been 0 for over 10 years. But 5 or 6 months ago, a risk of recession in the next 12 months of 5% and 10% and 15% was the answer to the survey based on our work, because there was a risk of recession out there. I'll get to that. Today, when I speak to you, risk of a U.S. recession next 12 months, 0. Am I crazy? Pollyannish? A dreamer? Old enough to dream? Young enough to think I'll live forever? Gotta be kidding. This is based on hard work on the business cycle, looking at the U.S. economy and at the uncharted territory of an unprecedented long expansion into its 11th year. 0 chance of a recession the next 12 months. Looking out, what gives us recessions in the U.S., except for one episode we cannot see in our work, and so no recession until well after the election into 2022. That's another 3 years. Uncharted territory, uncharted waters. The message, the U.S. expansion will go on. How many of you saw the movie Titanic? Remember the song, My Love Will Go On? This is going to go on. And we've had 5 major recession scares in the last 10 years, and every time, at the time of it, the odds on recession going out 12 months, for me, were 0. And everybody looked at me like I was crazy, and I am. I'm a madman scribbling in the air. But Keynes described economists as madmen scribbling in the air. But silly politicians listen to these madmen scribbling in the air. That's why do I see it that way? Well, we look at the U.S. and world economies and dozens of pieces of information every day in a national economic systems approach. It's very, I won't call it artificial intelligence, it's very automated with a framework of cause and effect and files that immediately give us data, plug the data into models, so we get in seconds and minutes implications of data. The analogy I draw is people and the human body, the system. Economics and finance, that's part of a system. Systems have generic similarities between them, characteristics that are very similar. And these are the superficial measurements. And so when you go to your doctor or go in a hospital, they take all kinds of vitals. And suppose your vitals are good. Does it mean you're healthy inside? Does it mean you're healthy? I can guarantee you it doesn't mean that anymore. You look at this man who looks good. Guess what? Now with all this imaging machines, they look inside me. I got the heart of a 50-year-old. That's what they tell me. I've got the bone marrow of an 85-year-old. they can age every single organ in your body. The number means nothing at all. The imaging machines will find things, incipient illnesses, that nobody would have ever found before. A lot of false alarms, but not always false alarms. Well, I'm a doctor of the economy, not a medical doctor. I did go to medical school, and that's, you notice the analogy here to the systems of your body and of the economy, but it's generic. Systems are systems. There are similar characteristics. These are dynamic systems. They have interactions. They have leads and lags. All the organs inside of you touch each other in some way. Some really matter, some don't. Look inside the U.S. economy. Inside now, not the superficial numbers, industrial production, retail sales. Says to me that this is a functionally very young economy. We look at the consumer sector and the household balance sheet as well as the consumer. And what do we see? We see a high savings rate, almost 8%, in part from tax cuts. Consumption spending, real inflation adjusted, 2.75%. It's popped up from 4 or 5 years ago. The household balance sheet in terrific shape. The debt to asset ratio, student loan debt is too high, but debt to asset ratio in aggregate, okay. Interest charges to assets and income, short to long-term debt. Various measures of the financial health or not health of the consumer, the household, we look at very hard. You have to look inside the consumer to find it. The normal economic work will go as far as the savings rate and stop. We look to see where savings goes. Household sector's in great shape. The fundamentals, jobs and income, number one, that determines spending. Sentiment, low interest rates, plenty of finance available. A tremendous stock market, which for many has been very helpful, the wealth effect. And the household balance sheet. What took down the American consumer and the world because of the collapse in residential real estate, 2006-07, and everything else with it, a bubble that took us down, that reverberated through. The condition of the inside of the U.S. economy, the consumer sector, the business sector, the financial system, the banks, the government, was very fragile in 2006-07. Any shock might have knocked it over, and it did. Residential real estate prices diminished in their pace, a bubble in residential real estate, everything erected on it. There was a bubble in the stock market, there was a bubble in debt. They all collided, and we had a horrible downturn. Just the opposite is true now, and has been every time we've taken a good look inside to see whether we'd really have a recession. Consumption's 70% of the economy. That's a big deal. Trade, net exports, 3% of the economy. Trade can't take us down if it deteriorates. The consumer can take us down. Business capital spending last year was negative. We think it's going to pick up this year, in part because the uncertainty of trade has quieted down. That's 10 to 15% of the economy. Residential construction on low interest rates is now rising. Federal government purchases, 6.5% of the economy, now very aggressively spending because we did a deal on the budget, agreed on by Democrats and Republicans. That's about 90% of the economy. The U.S. economy, in our view, is going to keep going. I can't tell you when I see the next recession. It has to be, my work, beyond 2021. This is ex-shocks. Shocks, if the Mideast had exploded, maybe that might have done it. It's sailing. On top of that, the economic growth in the U.S. momentum is picking up. And so for next year, the expectation on the U.S., 2.5 to 2.75%, fourth quarter over fourth quarter. That's above consensus. It's above the Federal Reserve. That is above potential output. We should see with it some gentle rise of inflation, but technology may prevent that from happening, as it has. The unemployment rate, we are projecting to get down to low threes. Throughout the last 4 or 5 years, we've had the unemployment rate going to where it is now. Now it's a little lower in the forecast. And corporate profits, we use S&P 500 operating earnings because they're levered into the stock market. we're expecting to rise 6 or 7% in 2020. That's a very good year for the U.S. economy. Message number one, uncharted territory. Can this boat keep sailing in this ocean, a very wavy, chaotic ocean, and keep growing with no recession? Answer today is yes. The world economy, the U.S. is a big part, not as big as it used to be. But what I'm describing is, of course, help to all trading partners of the U.S., direct and indirect. And certainly because of the presence of American companies in businesses all over the world, where everybody buys and sells, distributes all over the world, where 45% of U.S. company sales are outside, a stronger U.S. economy than this year is going to be helpful in terms of the exports, trade, and business tourism of lots of countries around the world. We're looking at the Eurozone, which was very disappointing last year in terms of growth, picking up a little bit, 1.5% to 2%. It's pretty anemic, but no further deterioration. Monetary policy is very stimulated in the Eurozone. We will wait to see if they get any fiscal stimulus. There's a lot of talk about that. My view is a lot of the world needs fiscal stimulus because monetary policy alone is not giving strong enough growth results and not getting inflation to the target of the Eurozone, just a little under 2%, to the target of Bank of Japan, 2%, to the US, 2% asymmetric inflation target. It's not happening. So monetary policy needs help. In the US, we do have fiscal stimulus. So look at the US. Inflation running 1.5%. Economy, 2.5, 2.75. The unemployment rate in the low threes, lowest in 50 years, lowest ever. Jobs, last 3 months, 184,000 a month. We think that'll slow down to 140,000 a month. That's more than enough. Profits up 6 or 7%. Easy money, fiscal stimulus, both on taxes still and on government spending. That's what you see in the third year of an expansion, not in the 11th year. And what keeps it going is that low inflation and central banks having to get inflation up. The wind is at the back of every economy where a central bank wants to get inflation up. It's a necessary condition for good growth. It's not sufficient. The U.S. has done fiscal stimulus. It is definitely working. Tax cuts. Other countries need to do it as well. And the appetite for that varies across the world. Japan, where I just was the last 2 days, we're looking at the numbers that are close to the Bank of Japan, the Ministry of Finance, maybe a little stronger, 1.5, 1.75%. The fundamentals of the Japanese economy is presented to me by both economists at the Bank of Japan and Ministry of Finance. Actually looks very good. And so we think Japan will carry its weight as the fourth largest economy in the world. And then we come to China. And China, as the second largest economy in the world, a very big deal, directly and indirectly through trade and other reasons. We get a number tomorrow, U.S. time, on the Chinese GDP. Our models have it at another decline, down to 5.8 or 5.9%. Consensus is 6 year over year. We think that's the bottom of growth. On the high frequency indicators we monitor from China, the policy stimulus has been put in. The growth rate decline that's gone on in China for a number of years now, from 11% down to 6%, should stop and gently pick up. That'll be a very big deal for the world economy because the size of the Chinese economy, the direction of movement shifts in the dynamic system, makes for a big deal. So we are looking this year for the world economy, the U.S. to do better, Japan the same or a little better than last year. China start to pick up a little, the Eurozone to do a little better, the developing countries to follow along. A better year for the global economy as we measure it, 4.5% I think versus 4.3% last year. And a global economy that when I give this talk, people say, what's he smoking? It sounds that optimistic. But that's where we are in this uncharted waters that we are traveling in. Uncharted water number 3. Here I'm paddling out in the lake, never been out there before. Policy, particularly monetary policy. How long can all the central banks stay easy? The answer is a long, long time. Why? They all have targets of about 2% inflation, and inflation is well under that target. Their job is to get inflation to 2%. In Europe, a little less than 2%, US asymmetric 2%, Japan 2%. And it's not happening. They are puzzled by why it's not happening. The paradigm they used, the Phillips curve paradigm, told them that with the unemployment rates going down the way they have in Japan and even Europe, in Germany in particular, the US, inflation should have picked up, but it didn't. Something new and unusual is going on, and they don't know what it is. But they do know that they've got to get to 2%, and so in the case of the United States, Chair Powell, realizing that, shifted monetary policy along with his colleagues, did an abrupt U-turn, and after having raised interest rates, started cutting them. And now they're resting at the current federal funds rate, which is a little over 1.5%, to see what happens. And what the Federal Reserve told us in their last meeting in December, which was huge, essentially, you know what, we will not be in the way of the economy growing faster because, I'm paraphrasing now, because we need to get to 2% inflation, and it takes a stronger economy to get there in a tighter labor market, and we no longer believe that just because the unemployment rate's low, we're going to have accelerated inflation, because it hasn't happened in years, in my view, decades. They finally, and this is uncharted water, message number 4, threw out the Phillips curve and are searching, I can tell you in central bank research meetings, for a new way to understand inflation. And so every time I talk to a central banker, they want to know, why is inflation so low? Because they're not making their target. Now, for us in the world of business and finance, it's good that they're not making their target. It means monetary policy and money, interest rates, will be easy for a long, long time. And at the meeting of December 11th, the Federal Reserve said, we're not going to be in the picture in 2020 at all. No members indicated it would be appropriate to have a higher funds rate in 2020. Short-term rates in the US are fixed, much as they are in Japan, by this statement of the Fed, except our rates are higher than the zero rates in Japan. Both countries are way behind on 2% inflation. So when I was at the Bank of Japan, at 2 of my meetings, one with Governor Kuroda, and I can say this in public, I don't think he'll mind. He said it in public himself. How do we get to 2%? Maybe the number's wrong. Where did the 2% come from? It doesn't matter. Their job is to get to 2%. As long as that's their job, they're not going to raise interest rates. Can they keep on lowering them when they're as negative as they are in Japan and in Europe? Probably not. So how in the world do economies respond and inflation pick up if there's no more room for monetary policy to stimulate? Answer, monetary policy can't do it. It's a liquidity trap. It's classic. Fiscal stimulus is needed as a source of aggregate demand unless suddenly the European consumer, the European business sector, Japanese consumer lifts spending for some reason to provide the aggregate demand that will raise inflation. Or there's some cost shock, like oil. Well, number 3, number 4, the death of the Phillips curve. 3rd, monetary policy in 2020 and beyond, easy and accommodative everywhere in the world, interest rates low, and they're going to stay low. In the case of the United States, the Federal Reserve is just taking itself off the table as a factor. Now, when they did this in the middle of December and produced that statement, in the same week the ECB indicated much of the same thinking. And we had 2 trade agreements signed or announced, the phase 1 agreement with China that was just signed today. And we had the Democratic House passing the USMCA, the trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. And we had Brexit, 63% vote. And the impeachment, all in 1 week, all these things happened. The impeachment proceedings became clear that President Trump, there would be articles of impeachment that go to the Senate, and the Senate isn't going to find him guilty so that he will be the presidential candidate. Suddenly, all the uncertainty of 2019, uncertainty and risk, got resolved in 1 week by these events, at least in my mind, and reset the backdrop for looking ahead in a very different way. Positive, positive. The U.S. is basically through with its rejiggering of trade that President Trump promised in 2016. China was the big thing. The phase one agreement, there's lots to do. We'll see whether they keep their word. China, to me, looks like they're behaving very responsibly. It looks to me like the U.S. got the better end of the deal, but it was already balanced against the U.S. anyway. And the North American trade agreement, we don't think it's that much different from what we had before. It's got a new brand, a new name. It's got the Trump name on it. He's happy with that. We have to deal with Europe and a couple other countries. But the worst of the trade struggles and the possibility of another trade war or reemergence of what went on with China went away that middle of December. Any worry about central banks, especially the Federal Reserve, getting away with higher interest rates went away on those two meetings. And the political uncertainty in the U.S. around what was going to happen to Trump, in my view, that went away too. It became clear what the path will be. And then the U.K. is leaving the Eurozone. That's been an uncertainty there for 3 or 4 years. Wow. Does uncertainty matter? For financial markets, it does matter. Financial markets, we know that markets price uncertainty and risk. That's just how they price. Sometimes the risk turns to reality, and then you'll get a bear market or a bull market, depending on which way it's going. But it's a very important thing for financial markets. What about the economy? The research on uncertainty and what that means for economics and the real economy is sparse. But I can tell you on my research and what I've read of the literature in this and people who've done it, for the business sector, uncertainty and risk is a very important issue. Businesses plan for the future. They look to see what sales will be, what their revenues will be, and they're looking out in the future. They look to see what their earnings will be, what the cash flow will be. Will they have enough money to spend on what they want to expand and do? Capital goods, for example, hiring people. The cost of capital for business is next to nothing in terms of the empirical work I've done in driving business capital spending. It's all about expected sales and revenues. And if you think about it, those of you who run businesses, of course, are you going to put money out, commit for a year or two, if you're not sure what's going to be the case, if you have a wide range of possibilities? And that was the case last year. So our thought is that business CapEx, which was negative in the US last year, will turn positive. And that resolving of uncertainty in the 3 dimensions I mentioned in the middle of December was, to me, a very big deal and made me think very positively about the future of economies and, more importantly, financial markets, particularly the equity market. Well, what's happened since the middle of December? We've had tremendous runs up in the equity markets, which is empirical evidence that this thought wave and hypothesis I've offered you is so far, now tomorrow we tumble maybe? No, I don't think so. But so far is getting empirical support. What that means to us is on the stock market, and here is uncharted waters number 5 or 6, how long does the US equity bull market go on? It goes on as long as the expansion goes on. Equity bear markets anticipate a turning point in the economy or in the growth of the economy by anywhere from 6 to 18 months. Now, I just told you our view is, by looking inside, outside, all around, that this expansion goes on into 2022. By the way, it doesn't mean I'm going to go away and not watch it. I watch it every day because every day you can be wrong, proven wrong. That's the nature of the scientific method. So, but if I think the expansion is going to last in the US that long, then I don't think we get a bear market until 2021, which would anticipate the turning point in the economy. That's another couple of years. That's another couple of years. The equity market goes on and on and on. The equity bull market goes on. And then the question is, how do you price it? How much up is up in the longest equity bull market ever, and we're probably approaching the biggest percentage change here at about 32, 50, 60 on the S&P 500. Well, interest rates now are set not to rise. The Federal Reserve is out of the way. Valuations can be higher on lower interest rates. That's fundamental. Expected earnings discounted to the present with some measure of the discount rate, and part of that is interest rates. So that's a plus. And when the Federal Reserve shifted interest rates down, that pumps up the PE ratio that we use against forward earnings. That's fundamental in any pricing of assets, including the stock market. The other big fundamental is future earnings. And the anticipation on us, for us, of that 6 to 7% rise in earnings on the kind of economy I've presented gives us an S&P 500 operating earnings this year of 180 or 181. The consensus is 176, so we're a little above the consensus. And next year we're 191 on an expanding economy, which is only 5 or 6% up on earnings on an economy that next year we think will grow 2.25, 2.5%. The PE value that we use now to price it is 18. That's a high in this economic and bull market cycle. In the 90s, using the methods that I'm still using, I was as high as 20. 18 times, we can do the arithmetic now, just to be sure I give you the right number. 18 times 180, we're into 2020. The forward earnings are the next 12 months. So I'm pricing this year's average earnings of 180, our number, 181, at 18. That's 3240 on the S&P 500. We're not far from there, so we're at fair value. What's the upside? Well, as time goes by this year, as long as we keep expanding, when we look out 12 months, next year's earnings will come onto the forward earnings lump. And by the end of the year, that number will be 191. So if 18 is still the PE ratio times 191, that's 3425 to 3450. That's the upside of the fair value range. The downside on the correction would be 2900. The range has been reset to the levels I've just given you. This is a bullish view, but recognizing we're fairly high at the current time. If inflation suddenly picks up for any reason, like a conflict in the Mideast bothered people for a couple of days, and oil prices skyrocket and you get a big burst of energy inflation, inflation goes up, the Federal Reserve sees inflation get above its 2% target, then they will not stay on that interest rate path. And what I've just calculated, I can't do that anymore on the way I do it. And that would lower the fair value for the stock market, and I would be talking to you bearishly, at least in a correction sense. But let me close with inflation and the major reason why it's so low, or reasons why it's so low, because in the system, that's the biggest risk. What will wreck up what I've talked to you about, which is a very positive picture looking ahead for economies and for the stock market, is hinged on low inflation and monetary policy responses to try to get to 2%, which none of the major central banks have been able to do in the last 8 or 9 years. Why? One reason is expected inflation has moved a lot lower in countries where there are measures of expected inflation. And here's an observation by the Nobel Prize winner Bob Solow, which is really a time series observation. We have inflation because we expect it, and we expect it because we have it. So Bob Solow, as a good statistician, looks at the time series and notices that when expected inflation goes down, and there are measures of it, It takes a long time before expected inflation moves in any direction. Once it goes down, actual inflation seems to follow. And when actual inflation is lower, depending on the reason why, then people expect inflation to be lower because actual inflation is lower. And they expect then lower inflation, then actual inflation after that stays low. It doesn't really get to the heart, this comment, of why and how all this works. It's an empirical observation that really does work. What's happened to expected inflation? In Japan, Governor Kuroda, big thing he watches is expected inflation. It's moved down on the measures they look at. So he's thinking if it moves down, it's going to be very hard to get actual inflation up because it's an important variable. Our Federal Reserve has noticed, and we have noticed, expected inflation on various measures has turned down. That anchors down actual inflation. It augurs against inflation running higher and suggests inflation can keep running lower. How important is it? In models where we use several different sources of inflation, expected inflation has a powerful weight. There is some serial correlation in that, but it's powerful. So I'm convinced, because expected inflation is low, even though I don't understand exactly how it got low, I suspect it's low because actual inflation is low, because everything we do in the United States, we keep getting discounts. I buy Amazon. It's cheap. I show a vendor something I can buy on Amazon and they match the price. I comparison shop on the internet, cars, and I get a rock bottom price for a car. There are some outfits that will even ship it to you. You don't even have to go and get it. Tell them what you want. It's technology that's going on that is providing transparency on prices, helping to keep inflation lower. And Americans, Koreans, Japanese, they all know that. So why would I think inflation is going to run away if everywhere I go I'm getting better prices, discounts and sales? And I can, using technology, save money. Plus, real purchasing power is higher. It's technology that's doing that, this incredible wave of technology that we have. The second major factor has to do with explaining why the Phillips curve, the relationship between unemployment and inflation, has shifted down. And for us, it is technology, what I call disruptive technology, transformational technology, and innovational technology. Here's a transformational technology. Right here, we all know it, it's all around us. This is the iPhone. I'm sorry about that, I'm here in Seoul, I should be talking about the Samsung. My son uses, I want you to know, he uses the Samsung phone, so my son's a bright guy, so he's wise to use it. I happen to be using the iPhone. It's a camera, it's a restaurant reservation, it's everything. Look at that, look at that. My wife uses the Apple Watch, which is tied to the iPhone, so she's gone miniature. I can't believe it, what you can do with this. It's mind-boggling. Now, the kids know more than I know about what you can do with it. I'm just learning. So I did all my Christmas shopping on the internet in December. Guess what? I'm a convert. I'm tired of fighting for parking places at malls. I don't like walking around the shops. On the internet, I can see a whole array of, and I can order it. They're on sale. They ship it. It's at my house the next day. My God, I can sit in my bathroom and do everything I have to do just using this. It's an amazing, amazing transformational item. And I've gotten rid of all our landlines. Think of the money that sells, because you don't need it now. The cellular, and then what is there? There's Amazon. There's Uber. I took Uber in Tokyo. It's cheaper and came very quickly. Everywhere we look, it's all around us. It's all around us. So Bob Solow, who's wonderful at these comments, when the computer was the big technological innovation in the United States, he went back in the 80s. It was before the internet. The computer was for, every decade, the US has a huge technological change. See, my wife can get me anywhere I am. That was my wife. You're stuck, no matter what goes on. I apologize for that. Anyway, the ability to do things to save time, it's economics. It's going to be used more and more and more. And it shows up in lower inflation and a lower unemployment rate, because look at all the people that are now being employed in this world Google, number of people they're hiring. And given the way Americans are spending money, and I think it's going on in Japan and Korea, there's a boom in coffee houses. It's amazing because we have more leisure time because we're freed from the time intensity by these devices. And we have other time, and what do people like to do? They like to go out and buy coffee. It's just the flavor, and we have tremendous increase in jobs in leisure and hospitality in the United States in healthcare. That's where the jobs growth is, not in manufacturing, because the robots have eliminated people. And that's just the way it is. But it is efficient, and it means that you have a lower inflation rate and a lower unemployment rate at the same time, and productivity is higher. Now, when we add a source of what I call the new technology, the capital stock, to an equation that has productivity in it, and it's an expectations augmented Phillips curve, we add to the explanation of inflation with the capital stock of software, proprietary software. We have data for that now, a little bit. That's a measure of technology and productivity. When we add measures of technology and productivity to standard inflation equations, we do better than the standard paradigm that's used by many, including the Fed, expectation augmented Phillips curve, in explaining inflation. It shifts down the Phillips curve. The big lever is technology, and here's one final for inflation. Final example. It was a disruptive something discovered in the United States called fracking. What happened a week or so ago? The President of the United States ordered the assassination of a senior leader of another country. That's what he did. They spent 7 days planning it. History will tell us exactly why he did it, but pinpoint preciseness with a drone, another example of technology. The man was killed. Now, he's a bad man. Everybody says he's a bad man. Good riddance. Iran, of course, if it happened here in Korea, or if it happened in the United States, you'd be up in arms. If North Korea shot somebody who was near the head of your government. Or in the United States, if the Secretary of Defense or some military general had been killed by a Middle Eastern person, we'd be going to war. We didn't know what was going to happen, but anything that goes on in the Middle East immediately conjures up oil prices will skyrocket if the confrontation or shock gets out of hand. Energy costs will go up, inflation goes up, growth goes down, maybe we'll have a recession. Can't work that way anymore because the United States is the #1 producer of crude oil. In 1973, when oil prices were quadrupled by the Middle East, by the Saudis, in OPEC, the United States hardly produced any oil, crude oil. That's a huge change. Why? Fracking, the technology of fracking, United States, is what vaulted us into the #1 oil producer, plus business and energy companies wanted to be there because, you know, oil on average prices tend to go higher, and if you're an energy company, you want to be out there competing. The United States now is the #1 producer of crude oil. When crude oil prices go up, I don't want to sell U.S. stocks. I want to buy them, particularly the energy sector, because we no longer have a specter of ever rising crude oil prices because we control the supply, either controlled or endogenous. Huge. It came from technology, fracking. On the consumer side, Japan, Korea, the United States, in terms of market baskets of consumers, use much less oil and energy-related as a portion of income than ever before. It's hardly anything now. It's energy efficiency. So the balance of the U.S. as a net consumer of oil and energy, even of Japan, changed hugely. And so what went on in the Mideast, I think if it had kept going on, we would not have gotten oil prices going to 100, 110. In the stock market, you've got to sell and do risk off, do all that stuff, but the fundamentals of that shock, because of technology and the adjustments of our economies and structure to technology and to oil efficiency. Look at the cars, electric cars, hybrids, all that. Energy efficiency is huge compared to what it was. You can't have the same reaction as we had in the 1970s technology. Technology, I offer as the biggest source of the unusually low inflation that we and central banks are seeing. As long as we are lower than 2%, the central banks have to be friendly and supportive. I have to be bullish on equity markets when I see that. So we still like the stock market. I think when I was here last year, I told you, and it did a lot better than we thought on the major indices across the world. We still like stock markets. We think the U.S. expansion goes on. The world expansion does a little better. Earnings will be up. And our view is that the stock markets, in terms of asset allocation, is still the place to be. Whether it's Korea, Japan, Europe, the United States. We have been more overweighted in the United States, but we are putting some money to work in China as well in the money management that I do. And a good year for economies, good year for stocks. And then we come to the U.S. election, and odds are President Trump will run for the Republicans. The impeachment is clear. It's been given to the Senate. The Senate will acquit him. He then will be running for president. And that means more pro-business, pro-growth policies if he were to be elected. He will run, I'm quite sure, on peace and prosperity. The U.S. economy, on all measures, is in a prosperity stage of the business cycle. Our people are very unhappy despite that. They're worried about the long run. No attention is being paid to inequality. No attention is being paid to global warming. They're uncomfortable, and lots of people worry about our deficits and debt. I don't. It's not a big factor right now. They're uneasy. The middle class in America are squeezed horribly, and they feel it. And that's part of why President Trump got elected. He found a way to appeal to the squeezed and disadvantaged Americans who have been left out. It's unusual to see this in the kind of prosperous, by ordinary measures, world of the U.S. that I see. But Americans are happy. The sentiment surveys say they are happy. And I'm sure that they will see and have jobs. We're short people in terms of jobs, and the money will be there. And history says if that's the case, the politicians who sell that win election. I think he will also argue that he's made the U.S. safer by his very unusual kind of foreign policy. That is quite arguable. Who knows how the Iran thing might have gone. It could have gone another way and been a disaster with major flare-up in the Middle East. I do believe he'll argue that, and that's how you win elections. What will be interesting in our case in the United States, and what I get from polls, from talking to people, Republicans and Democrats, my own views, is the man. The man will be an issue in our election. Normally, anyone that will preside over an economy like this, if it's the way it is come November, is going to win. And people in his party will win with him. But this man is different. And he upsets a lot of people in a moral and ethical way. I have to be careful what I say because I don't take sides. I can report with psychiatrist friends of mine who have their biases, that many of them live in Cambridge, and I think they're a little nuts themselves. My psychiatrist friends in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that's where they all live, close to each other. They treat each other, so I kid them. But they tell me he's pathologically ill, and they don't even have words to describe it. No doctor can go on television and say that because of HIPAA rules. That's what they tell me. I'm reporting it to you. You can make your own judgment. If I were on a board and he were my CEO, I've been on boards, he would never last. Because he won't. He runs it his own way. He doesn't do what the board says. They would fire him. If he were on my board and I were president, I would not ask him to be on my board because he would just do his own thing. It just doesn't work that way in a bureaucracy. It's just the way he is. He's dealing with our allies and the international events in a very unusual way. I don't know what they say in private or public, but they must be bewildered by some of the behavior. And, you know, I read The Art of Making a Deal. It gave me some insight into the man. And he's very clever in a lot of ways. The Twitter thing is absolute genius. Look, the press doesn't like me. They misreport me. In my view, they misreport me. I'm not sure they misreport him, but they have those biases. And so why should I talk to the press? I want to talk to the people who are going to vote for me. I'll do it on Twitter. Twitter's new technology available, and we will never be the same in the world. The community, the reporters may not have any, sorry about that, you may not have a job. The Twitter's going to do you out of business. I mean, why do I need you to report? If I had a Twitter, I'd just do it. I don't need you to report on what I'm saying. And so I must say that was a genius stroke to do that. Not somebody tell him, or did he figure it out? I think he figured it out. And the other thing he figured out in 2016 was how unhappy so much of America was. Mrs. Clinton did not have a clue. Why? She's too smart. Smart people don't quite get down with ordinary people and understand their pain and angst. How do I know? I grew up in Detroit, poor, city that was up and down because of the auto industry. I lived with people, and we looked at the East Coast and said, they don't listen to us. She never got that. He listened to the people, and that's part of why he got elected. So this is a very interesting election, but I do think it's not just the economy, it's the man. And we do not know, the Democrats, what policies may come. I can't really talk to you much about today. It's quite clear if it's Trump who wins, we'll have more pro-growth, pro-business policies, and I think the stock market will like that. But there are plenty of people who are in the Wall Street world, Republicans, who really think the man does not represent the values of the United States and is out of sync, and will vote for some Democrat that comes along that they can take. I have to handicap the election. I think I might be wrong on this forecast. After I heard him talk in New York, I put his odds at 60-40. He should win on the economy, and I'm not sure what he'll do on the peace side, but he should win on that. But I don't know how my country will deal with the issue of the man and how he is as a representative of what many of us think are the real values of America, how we feel about our country. We'll see. Thanks for being patient with me, as you always are in my comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sinai, for your illuminating speech with especially positive notes. Although we already past 9 in the morning, I would like to invite a few questions before we letting Allen go.
Go ahead, fire away, yes.
Oh, okay, Mr. Kim over there, yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for your all-inclusive explanations of the economy and politics as well. Every January, I look forward to hearing you here. I have one hypothesis where I like to bounce on your opinion. Economists have been struggling with the answer to the why the unemployment is low, yet it does not cause inflation to go up. One hypothesis I have in my mind is that I'd like to hear your opinion, is that technology is reducing the cost everywhere, not only the production cost, but particularly in the distribution area. It used to be there is a tremendous amount of gap between the cost of production and reaching to the consumers. That's vanishing very fast, as you pointed out, the Amazons, etc. And at the same time, the demand is also declining in the sense that these days people are fluent everywhere. There is no such thing as you must have this car or this, or else I'm going to die tomorrow kind of things. They may have some luxury items which may want to buy if they are so inclined, but the pressure is not there. It's not really that, So the demand pressure is lower, and the cost of goods reaching is also low, and that answers the question for why, in spite of the unemployment being low, it's not causing the pressure on the inflation side. And that's one side. And the other one is a question in your mind. You pretty much answered. There has been speculations in the U.S. about the last election. Trump was behind 1.5% in the popular vote, yet had a very solid electoral vote. Now, with a tremendously negative impact going on Trump's personality, there have been speculation is that in this new election, he could be as far as 5% behind the popular vote, yet his electoral vote will even increase to 230. I'd like to hear your opinion about that.
Right. On the first one, I quite agree with you. It's softer demand and low cost. That's part of the framework that keeps inflation down. I would add to that the possibility that the supply side of the U.S. economy is growing faster than conventionally thought. If technology is giving us more productivity than the conventional statistics measure, then potential supply growth is probably higher. The evidence of it is how low inflation stays. So you've got a gap between demand and supply from both sides, and that's part of thinking, which is levered by technology on the supply side for me. And agreeing with you. On the popular versus electoral vote, one example is the state I grew up in, Michigan, where Trump won by 12,000. He campaigned very vigorously there. His last visit, he really insulted a revered congressman, Dingell, in Michigan. I think he's very popular in Michigan. I don't think the Democrats will make the mistake of not campaigning that Mrs. Clinton did. And so that's an electoral vote source there for the Democratic candidate, as long as the Democratic candidate goes. So I don't think I agree with he could do poorly on the popular vote by losing major states a lot, like New York and California, which Mrs. Clinton won, so she wins the popular vote, but she didn't do her job on the electoral vote. I doubt that the Democrats, certainly Biden won't. He's already campaigning there. Bloomberg wouldn't. I think none of them will make the mistake that Mrs. Clinton did by not campaigning in those swing states. And that will be a question of how they go. Neglect is part of what gave him a victory on electoral count. And I doubt that that'll happen this time.
Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Sinai, for a very stimulating lecture. I have two questions. One, when you started the lecture, you mentioned about the lack of data in the new uncharted water and the uncertainties about many of the way to judge things. Yet it seems that you have been focused on the Phillips curve, it's dead. And many of the predictions you have made are based on conventional tools of analysis that applies more to the past than to the present. So how confident are you that these tools are compatible with the new uncharted water that we are in? Of course, probably they're the only ones we have, but is it limited to the Phillips curve, or do you think that other fundamentals in the science as well and the tools you use will have to be adjusted very quickly as well to make more accurate predictions? On the second side, on the positive view you gave, you seem to have been, I would be shared, but more on the positive side in terms of things that have been residing in terms of the global tensions, particularly with China. While some of the analysis, or many of the analysis we've been hearing, that it's kind of an existential struggle between like a rising superpower and one that's trying to contain it or slowing down. This seems to be an evidence of more friction to come, more than something that's subsiding and giving more security for the future. So how would you assess that also in terms of your positive outlook? Thank you.
Those are great questions. The first one I'm smiling about because the answer is not very confident at all. So I wake up every day expecting to be wrong. And that's the protection you have in terms of what I say, because I wake up every day thinking that about anything. Now, my wife has taught me to think that way, that everything I do might be wrong. That's what happens when you're married 56 years, it says I am. So you get trained to be kind of risk. I am not confident. I work very hard. I'm scared to death. I can tell you story after story about a forecaster who's scared to death of being wrong. That's protection against not being wrong. What I do that other members of the profession don't is use anecdotal evidence quite a bit. And I must say that despite what I was taught and taught as a professor, which is to use public data to test hypotheses, the anecdotal evidence put in a systematic framework has been immensely helpful in terms of understanding what goes on, including the questions I get from people who are out there in the world. So I am a collector of anecdotal data. I talk to everybody, taxi drivers, everybody, Uber drivers, anybody, and ask how things are going. I walk around the malls and see what the pricing is, and it's very valuable. Our profession is beginning to admit that anecdotal evidence is legitimate, but we're scientists. We never have enough evidence. We never have enough data, and I can tell you some, too long for now because it's already late, some very funny stories about some very famous economists who made some big mistakes in their portfolio because they didn't have enough data and the markets took after them. So the answer is not very confident. The protection is, here's the method, is when the models I build and work so hard to build, which are structural, macro, econometric, tested with data in all kinds of ways, begin to fail and give me errors, I have two choices once I make all the technical adjustments. I can believe my models and just go on, or I can believe the world. Now, I do not have a high enough IQ to believe my models. I believe the world. And with that view of it, thinking the world is right, I might be wrong, and starting to investigate, I've come to amazing insights of understanding about why things happen the way they do. So that's my method. And if I were like the guys who ran, what was that outfit that went down the tube in the late 1990s? Something or other, the Nobel Prize winners. Well, they're never wrong. That's why they're Nobel Prize winners. Their paradigms, their models are always right. They think they're always right until they're wrong. And they got destroyed because aberration things happen. So plus we filter a lot. On the second one, which was, quickly summarize the second part of you. I think we are in a world of more geopolitical stuff happening. The question is, where does it hook into an economy? So markets will always trade on stuff like that. But economies don't necessarily run on that unless it becomes permanent and changes oil prices, or in your country there's a change in leadership, and Egypt changes its trade policies in the Middle East, finds oil, whatever, then it would make a difference. But otherwise, all the stuff that goes on. And it's interesting, the markets basically ignore, and people wonder why, a lot of the craziness that goes on in the world, because it's not fundamental. It's just for the traders for an hour or two, three, if they can figure it out and make some money, because they got to make money every day.
Given the time constraints, perhaps this may be the last question from Professor An.
Well, this question is partly related to the second question raised by the Egyptian ambassador. Perhaps I would like to add one more component of the uncharted water as far as Korea is concerned. President Trump really upside down the multilateral liberal trade order that affect Korea, in very badly in many ways. He walked off the TPP, and also he walked off the global climate the agreement, and also, he began the U.S.-China trade war, through which Korea has been suffered a lot. My question is that if President Trump re-elected, is there any chance for him to restore some of those global free liberal trade order? If Trump continued to play this role, and what I'm afraid is U.S. will lose a global the confidence and respect as a champion of free world system, trade system. Thank you.
Yes, my answer is no chance. No chance that he will reverse now what is on the books, in fact, it has changed the nature of trade and trade arrangements probably for a decade. And that's what happens when somebody comes in and makes those kinds of changes. Korea as a casualty, this is a man, this is off the record, who is a narcissist. Easy diagnosis to make. A destructive narcissist. He doesn't care who he hurts. That's the personality of the man. Now, I anecdotally know that when he was a kid, he was very disruptive. He would come into his house. We have a leaker. Somebody has whistle-blown through friends of ours who've told us about this, and I smile about it because kids are kids. And he would knock everything off the table. He would destroy stuff. That's the personality. Now, the destructive narcissist is a psychological issue. He's also a pathological liar. There's not a empathy gene, the psychiatrists tell me, in a destructive narcissist. It's all about that person, and everything serves that person. So I don't think if he's reelected, he's going to change what he did. And if you look at Trumponomics, and we really should get them a piece I wrote in November 19th, 2016 about Trumponomics, that may be one of the more precipient things I wrote in judging what it would be all about and how it was going to change the landscape, including the Fed, including the Supreme Court, though I didn't spend a lot of time on that. And I did say it would be very good for economics. If you look at what he has done on his plan, it's almost as if he had a bulletin board, starting with the economy, tax cuts in the economy, deregulation of regulation, immigration, healthcare was there, that hasn't happened. Kind of like 10 talking points. And this guy, unlike almost every other politician that's walked in Washington, keeps at it, one by one by one. The people who support him always mention this. He does what he says. He follows, whether you like it or not. And he's very tenacious. Look at all the tries at the courts to get his way. When he didn't get his way by court decisions, they have appointed, I think, 300 judges and changed the U.S. court system. Even more frightening for me, this is really off the record, and for nobody to ever say outside, because I don't know who's watching me. I have a call from the CIA. Somebody wants to get together with me in a few weeks. I don't know what to do about that. There's a book called Tyrant, written by a Shakespeare expert academic guy from a college, who describes the 5 Shakespeare tragedies that William Shakespeare wrote about. A really incredibly perceptive, sensitive writer, Shakespeare, unbelievable. Those tyrants, whether it was Macbeth, the others, all came to power, destroying people in their path. And of course, the man is not a fan of Trump who wrote this, but what strikes you when you read it, it sounds like Trump is a tyrant because of the characteristics of the people that come out of English history before you had a lot of rules and regulation in England. Well, you don't see people like that in history very much. And he kind of slipped into power. But I've just given you some dimensions to answer the question. I guess I'm really communicating a view encompasses when I say the man is an issue in the election, not just how the economy goes, because he's an aberration of history in our country. And I've just given you, this is evidentially based. I will admit the psychiatrists in Cambridge are very democratic, left-leaning, so I have to take in what they say. But I actually know about that personality disorder, a destructive narcissist. And so there's no doubt about it. And we know he pathologically lies because people keep track of all the lies. Is he a tyrant? Is he a despot? Is he one of those Latin American kings forever? We don't know. But what it does tell me is that whatever has been put into place he absolutely, if reelected, would not reverse it. He would go and finish the business he had started, would be my prediction.
Well, just one piece of information or announcement is that you may have an access to a fuller version of his presentation today by calling our office, our meaning IG office. You will have access to the detailed material, background material for his presentation. We didn't print them for you this morning because it's rather bulky. But before we let him go, for the interest of especially Korean press, would you say just very quickly one word about how you see the prospect of Korean economy this year?
Well,
I think
every
that's
year,
my
it's been
responsibility
positive every
to
year.
raise
You know,
this question.
I'm a doctor that doesn't like to bring bad news to anybody. Okay, I want you to feel good. Growth has been disappointing here on a GDP basis, and the country has some divisions with regard to societal aspirations of the government, and so it's more murky. But I think on the economics, a better China, a better U.S., the business of South Korea should be better, and we're overweight on the South Korean stock market because of a general bullish view on stocks and the power of South Korean business in terms of the ability to make money, and a view that the Korean stock market's undervalued at this point. So
Okay.
have a great year.
Okay, thank you very
Stay out of
much,
trouble.
Dr. Sinai, for your presentation.
Thanks for letting me go on.